Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back once again to the siege of Vraks and possibly the beginning of the end. After having been essentially stuck for many years at this point, the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army finally, after 9 years, broke through the second line of Vraksian defences. And after a short advance, they now found themselves entrenched against the inner line, the red line, which left all remaining Vraksian positions, including the main citadel, well and truly within range of Krieg heavy artillery. The breakthrough, however, had been costly in the extreme, which prevented a potential rapid breakthrough of the final defensive line. For whilst Imperial High Command and Lord Commander Julka's great push was, in the end, successful, it was only so by the narrowest of margins. Despite gathering an astonishing quantity of heavy artillery ammunition and guns, leading into a 4-day bombardment of near unparalleled intensity, the Vraksian defences, despite in many sectors having been categorically wiped off the map, held strong, with the defenders clinging on tenaciously in the very shell holes that had blown away their previous positions. And wherever the assault corps of the 88th made any real progress, they were quickly countered by waves of Vraksian mechanized infantry and armour, or potentially even worse, the might of the Alpha Legion Astartes. It got so bad that in a moment of rare candour, one Death Corps officer was even heard criticising High Command, stating that it would appear as if Imperial High Command had determined that the best way of breaking down a brick wall was to simply bash one's head against it until it collapsed. And you know things are going very badly indeed when the Death Corps of Krieg starts complaining about High Command being too pig-headed. But the rate of attrition was growing to such a level that even Lord Commander Julka could ill afford to ignore it any longer. After a week of continuous offensive operations across the entirety of the 88th Imperial Guard Army's front line, leading to casualties so far unseen in the entire campaign, even Imperial High Command was about ready to call it quits. Until the 468th Regiment, under the command of Colonel Attis, finally broke the deadlock in a nighttime surprise attack in Sector 5750. An attack, by the way, that was not even entirely sanctioned by Imperial High Command. The unusually resourceful colonel had begged, borrowed and stolen artillery support from several nearby independent artillery companies, in addition to acquiring additional ammunition for his own formation. He had then carried out an essentially unsanctioned nighttime attack upon the enemy's front line, using the cover of night along with a continuous artillery barrage from the various independent artillery companies he had formed relationships with. Colonel Attis and his men snuck out into no man's land, and at the end of their stealthy advance, they were less than 100 metres away from the traitors' front lines, which at the moment was under continuous artillery bombardment. And by the way, the margin of error on an Earthshake cannon, the most accurate artillery piece involved in the bombardment, is at least 150 to 200 odd metres. Generally speaking, Imperial Guard forces are instructed to keep at least half a kilometre's distance between themselves and any area currently receiving the gentle attentions of Imperial heavy artillery. The Colonel's plan was most certainly rather unorthodox and not without a hint of risk, but at a predetermined time just before dawn, the preparatory artillery bombardment lifted and rolled back deeper into the enemy's defences. Then Colonel Attis and his men rose up from their positions in no man's land, bayonets fixed, and stormed the traitors' forward defences, catching the enemy as they were just emerging from their underground bunkers and dugouts, trapping them in many cases down in the very defences they so recently sheltered from bombardment within, and those who were not trapped were cut down almost immediately as they rushed to their positions. Surprise was total, and the assault itself a magnificent success, leading to the first and so far only breakthrough of the Vraxian second defensive line. When the 11th Assault Corps rolled through the gap mere days later, it was all over for the Vraxian second line of defences, and just like the first, they had no choice but to initiate a massive scale withdrawal of their defensive line, lest they be rolled up and entirely annihilated. Luckily for the defenders, though, the Death Corps was utterly and completely exhausted, morally speaking, materially speaking, and physically speaking. They had no capabilities with which to launch a full-scale pursuit of the retreating Vraxians. But it was finally done after 7 days of near-endless bloodshed and slaughter. The second defensive line had been broken and overrun. Tragically, however, the breakthrough had cost the life of Colonel Attis, the man who had ensured the success of the offensive would not live to reap the rewards, or, knowing Lord Commander Julke, the potential court-martial. Regardless, the great push had eventually resulted in a success, although by the narrowest of margins. The siege army was entrenched outside of the final line of Vraxian defences, and now, according to plan, whilst the army was certainly well and truly behind schedule, all that remained now was to levy upon the final Vraxian positions a heavy and prolonged artillery bombardment. There was no need to attempt to blitz this line like they had tried to do with the second, because the enemy really now had no way of organising any sort of large operations against the Krieg Death Corps. Any attempt to mass forces or even just to move considerable quantities of weapons, men or material would be easily observable from the Krieg front lines, and therefore subject to intensive artillery harassing fire. And if the enemy were to try and congregate in any one sector, that too would be easily observable, and would draw the combined ire of virtually the entire artillery park of the 88th Siege Army, leading to the certain annihilation of the enemy's forces. And with the defenders essentially having been rendered immobile, then the Death Corps could take their time and reduce one enemy position at a time through prolonged and intensive artillery bombardment. What remained of the Vraxian defences would be destroyed position by position, mathematically and systematically, over the course of several years. Even Lord Commander Julke had at this point probably realised that there was no way he was going to be making his 12-year deadline, but as long as he did not require any further reinforcement, and could simply just sit back and utilise the vast stockpiles of ammunition still flowing into the Imperial Guard siege army, then eventual victory was as good as guaranteed. And the Lord Commander had plentiful political connections. He could make as many excuses as needed for the unfortunate delays, due, of course, entirely to the incompetence of his subordinates. And as long as victory, again, was ensured, some minor delays of a few years here and there could be overlooked. The Lord Commander appeared to have guaranteed his very first campaign victory. And what a triumph it was! The Lord Commander had defeated a skillful and tenacious foe, and not mere mortals, mind, but renegade Astartes. The Lord Commander had executed a successful campaign against Chaos Space Marines, who had given even the mighty Dark Angels a run for their money. The fact that the enemy had been from the very get-go monstrously outnumbered and surrounded, and the fact that the renegade Astartes only made up a minute portion of the defenders, were less important facets of the overall campaign. And with victory now a certainty and a mere question of time, the Lord Commander was set to make quite a killing, career-wise speaking, out of this campaign. But whilst the Lord Commander was busy preening and planning what he would use his newfound political capital for, his enemies were planning something quite different for the Lord Commander. After the breach of the second defensive line, the defenders of Vraks were essentially thrown into despair. They knew, as well as the Lord Commander, that any real hope of resisting the eventual Imperial victory was now more or less entirely gone. Cardinal Zaphon had retreated into his innermost sanctum, where he spoke only to Lord Arkos of the Alpha Legion for days and weeks on end. Lord Arkos, however, saw it a little bit differently. Whilst the Cardinal's forces may now face inevitable defeat, there were other forces in the galaxy that may yet provide the Cardinal with a way out. If only he would let Lord Arkos carry out certain rituals, certain acts on the Cardinal's behalf, Lord Arkos was confident that he could bring these interested forces here and ally them to the Cardinal's cause. It did take some convincing, because the ritual that Lord Arkos suggested certainly smacked quite thoroughly of heresy. But at this point, the Cardinal had already dug himself very deeply indeed into the occult mysteries that he was once introduced to by his faithful Deacon Mamoon, and frankly, with defeat staring him right in the face, there was really no turning back anymore. One last desperate roll of the dice it was then, and Lord Arkos received the go-ahead to set his sorcerers into action to call forth these allies that were so willing to help the Cardinal in his hour of need. The ritual did not go unnoticed by the Death Court of Krieg, as various unnatural phenomenons began occurring. They began to see odd mist coalescing out in no man's land. They began to see strange shapes taking form in this mist, unusual thunderheads, inside of which the men could swear they saw the outlines of something horrific. All of this was, of course, reported to Imperial High Command, but Lord Commander Julka had far more important things to worry about than some odd meteorological phenomenons on Vraks, a world that he now considered to be as good as one. Thusly, relatively undisturbed Lord Arkos' sorcerers were able to complete their ritual. It took weeks, possibly even months, to come to full fruition, but with no real imperative for the Death Court to make life difficult for them, they only had to contend with the mild annoyance of the occasional artillery bombardment, from which they were more than safe, sequestered as they were deep beneath the main Vraxian citadel. The ritual they were undertaking was a massive one, designed to extend an SOS signal, essentially, out to all the various corners of the galaxy, in the hope of drawing the Cardinal's much-needed reinforcements to Vraks, and to open a, relatively speaking, safe corridor through the warp for them to traverse. Normally, such a ritual is a huge and extraordinarily costly undertaking, requiring tens of thousands of sacrifices, hundreds of adepts, sorcerers, and dozens of magi to focus and guide the energies unleashed. On Vraks, however, things were considerably easier. The massive scale of slaughter unleashed on the planet over the preceding 9 years had left it steeped in bloodshed, horror, and carnage, a rich well of energy for the Alpha Legion magi and sorcerers to reach into and to harness. And so, after weeks of preparation, the signal was sent out loud and strong into the galaxy, reaching all the way into the Eye of Terror itself, where it found plenty of willing ears. In a completely different corner of the universe, Vigilant Station DM498-066 was one of tens of thousands of monitoring stations surrounding the Eye of Terror. As you can probably imagine, the warp lanes around the Eye are exceedingly well monitored in case something nasty pops out. And it had been noticing some rather unusual activity. It had noticed several large ships and also groups of ships travelling well outside the usual military and commercial lanes. This immediately sent alarm lights flashing all across the segmentum, since nothing is allowed to travel outside of these predetermined and heavily surveilled routes for any reason whatsoever, and any ship caught outside of these routes can be immediately destroyed by the Imperial Navy. There were, of course, the occasional incident of smugglers or crazy people, but this was far too frequent and appeared far too organized, as they also appeared to all be traveling in roughly the same direction. This was almost certainly some form of Chaos raiding force. Immediately, patrol groups were dispatched to systems that could be considered likely targets and/or valuable targets to the Imperium. Additionally, several cruiser groups were put on high alert and capital ships were readied, including the Emperor-class battleship Constantine Valdor. The apparent chaos activity had also drawn the attention of the Ordo Malus, who dispatched a null ship to confirm the location and size of the chaos force. Now, a null ship is an extraordinary piece of Imperial technology, laden down with the finest of auger and sensory equipment, with a tiny crew consisting of a handful of technicians and a single blank. A person who has a unique psychic mutation that renders them invisible in the warp. The null ship confirmed the Inquisition's fears. A sizable force of Chaos Raiders were gathering. So far, at least 30 ships had been identified, several of which were cruiser class, and their apparent target was Vraks. Battlefleet Scarus, which was already mobilizing, was now officially put on immediate alert notice. The entire battle fleet, including scout elements, cruiser fleets, and capital ships, would sally forth in an attempt to intercept the Chaos raiding fleet. If this was not possible, they were to pursue, trap, and destroy the fleet before it could cause any more damage. As a part of the general alert, all Imperial Navy commanders in the Scarus sector were ordered to stand to, and informed about the presence and likely location of the Chaos raiding forces. This, of course, included Rear Admiral Raziek, commander of the Imperial Navy flotilla stationed above Vraks. Although, to be entirely honest, the Imperial Navy presence in the Vraks system hardly deserved such a grand-sounding name as flotilla. During the first few years of the Vraks campaign, there was a real tangible fear of outside interference in the ongoing siege. As such, a relatively considerable Imperial Navy force was stationed to guard the system. The flagship was to be the lunar-class cruiser Lord Bellerophon, and it was further aided by a squadron of system defense monitors, and each incoming and outgoing convoy was to be guarded by its own escort of sword-class frigates. This was a considerable defensive force. A lunar-class cruiser is a ship of the line, able to trade blows with far larger opponents, and would by itself be more than enough to scare off pretty much anything in the way of usual Chaos raiding forces. The 3 system defense monitors also had more than enough firepower to make a daunting proposition for any force of pirates or system raiders. Add in several squadrons of sword-class frigates, and the Imperial Navy presence above Vraks was quite formidable. That, however, was at the start of the campaign. After now 10 years of deadlock, With little to no activity in the void, the Imperial Navy presence had been considered for a long time to be superfluous to requirements. First, the numbers of sword-class frigates required per convoy was reduced. Now there was only one squadron per 2 convoys. Then it was reduced yet further, and yet further again, until the Lord Bellerophon had to pull escort duty itself. After years of the remaining single squadron of sword-class frigates and the cruiser running escort duty around the system, they had both seen better days. A decade or so of near-constant wear and tear with very little in the way of maintenance will take a rather hefty toll on any machinery. The defense monitors remained stationed permanently above Vraks, however, and were in relatively good shape. All in all then, this left the Rear Admiral with 1 lunar-class cruiser operating on skeleton crew, 3 sword-class frigates also operating on skeleton crew and in desperate need of maintenance, and 3 defense monitors, which were the only ships in system that were considered combat ready, although they were starting to get a wee bit low on ammunition. Because whilst they hadn't seen any live targets to take their ire out on, it was necessary to conduct occasional firing drills. So, 3 frigates, 3 system monitors, and 1 cruiser against 30 Chaos Raiders of varying class, including several cruiser-sized vessels. Things were not looking rosy for Raziek, and one could make a rather plausible argument stating that at least some of this blame landed squarely on the Rear Admiral himself, who had for years insisted that the system and the supply lines there within was completely and utterly safe. There was no apparent threat to it or his fleet whatsoever. Painfully aware now of the gravity of his mistake, he nevertheless resolved to make the most out of it. The first thing he needed to do was to get more personnel aboard his ships. He therefore dispatched officers down to the planet below to round up anyone that looked useful from the Adeptus Mechanicus labor corps. Of course, these people would have quite literally 0 training in operating anything aboard a starship, but aboard Imperial Navy vessels, there are plenty of menial jobs for untrained, unskilled labor, and those whose jobs they were taking over might simply just be kicked up the ranking ladder to something more sophisticated. Now that the manpower issue was at least partially resolved, the second priority was to see if any of the other ships floating around the system could be used for something worthwhile. There were several large transport and freighters still in the system, and whilst of course these were not combat ships, it's not like he had the liberty of choice. And at the very least, in this area, the Rear Admiral was partially in luck. Due to the Dark Angel's somewhat overzealous neutralization of the Vraxian starport, any and all unloading of supplies and manpower was still an extraordinarily slow and piecemeal process. This meant that at almost all times there was a bit of a backlog above the planet, and after Lord Commander Julka's great push, there was even more so of one now than usual. And in amongst the transport ships, he found the bulk freighter Isra Mors, which had almost finished unloading its complement. Again, it was certainly no warship by any stretch of the imagination, but it did carry enough guns to defend itself, which was better than what Raziek could say for most of the other ships, of which there were currently 5 in system, 2 of which Raziek decided were armed enough to be worth, well, something at least. They were both smaller and less well armed and armoured than the Isra Mors, but again, the luxury of choice was something that Rear Admiral Raziek was rather bereft of. Entirely by accident, once again, Lord Commander Julka had actually provided Rear Admiral Raziek with a fighting chance. Due to, once again, the Great Offensive, there were far more freighters in system than usual, and by levying some of them into his defense force, he now had 3 further ships that could at least, to a degree, stand in the battle line. As for the remaining 3 freighters, they carried virtually nothing in the way of weaponry, at the very least nothing that would be worthwhile against other ships. So, instead, Raziek ordered all of these ships stripped of crew to be sent to his other vessels to further reinforce them, and then the 3 freighters, running on as little of a crew as humanly possible, would be loaded up with as much in the way of ammunition and flammable materials as possible. As a little extra, their plasma reactors would also be prepared to overload. These ships would then be formed into a fire ship squadron and sent hurling towards the Chaos Raiders, in the hopes of being able to ram one of the enemy's ships. The crew was ordered to escape just before impact, but, well, they don't call them suicide missions for nothing. And as a final piece in the preparations, the Rear Admiral sent his 3 Sword-class frigates out to the outer edges of the system to scout for the incoming Chaos Flotilla, hoping all the while that they wouldn't actually show up. And, of course, the Sword Squadron had strict orders to not engage anything they found on their scouting missions, even if they thought they could take it. Sword captains have in the past been known to be somewhat overly enthusiastic in the face of the enemy, often leading to their own violent demise. Assuming the escort captains were able to keep themselves in check and return without getting themselves blasted into space debris, the battle plan was simple and dictated primarily by necessity. The Lord Bellerophon would take the lead in any battle line, followed by the 3 Sword-class frigates and then the system defense monitors. And it was this part of the battle line that would be deciding when, where, and how it was going to move. System defense monitors are essentially just very large gun platforms, with the absolute bare minimum in the way of engines or maneuvering thrusters. They are usually, quite literally, towed into position, and not, generally speaking, expected to move all that far from said position. They can move under their own power, but they can only do so extraordinarily slowly. And so as to not split his already extraordinarily limited firepower, Raziek ordered that they decide the speed of the formation. Behind the system defense monitors came the armed merchantmen, essentially hiding behind them in the hope that they could maybe take a potshot or two at whatever the monitor had already mauled. And behind them again came the fire ships, held in reserve. They would hopefully be deployed in the midst of battle to ram an unaware enemy ship, as deploying them out ahead of the fleet, as would be traditional in more normal naval engagements, would in all due likelihood simply see them blasted to smithereens before they could really achieve anything. With as much in the way of preparations as actually possible having been made, all that remained was for the Rear Admiral to pucker his butt cheeks, grab his rosary, and start praying frantically that he'd done all of this work for nothing. This hope, however, was to be swiftly crushed by a report from the Sword-class frigate XO-43, reporting that she had made contact with at least 3 enemy vessels whose drive signature confirmed them as Infidel-class raiders, a well-known Chaos pattern ship. At this point, Rear Admiral Raziek was temporarily tempted to send in his Sword-class frigates to engage the Infidels. The Sword stands a fairly good chance of beating out an Infidel class, and considering they're in all due likelihood crewed by all manners of degenerates and renegades, while the Sword class would be crewed by the finest and most aggressive commanders in the Imperial Navy, odds were certainly on his side, but in void combat, you can never entirely get rid of the chance of a lucky hit or two, and if he lost a Sword-class frigate at this point, that would be a significant dip in his own resources, whilst for the enemy, losing 3 infidels, wouldn't be all too much of a problem, seeing as they were almost exclusively deployed in a scouting role at this point in time. The Admiral managed to rein in the more bestial impulses of his frigate captains, which in and of itself is quite the feat, and had them return to his own battle line. This did mean, however, that the three infidels would be able to gain a full and clear picture of the Admiral's forces, meagre as they were, and any hope of the Chaos Flotilla taking its time cruising into the system was now almost surely lost. Since they would now have a clear picture of what they were up against, they would probably simply rush into the system as fast as their engines could push them. But he deemed the off chance that the raiders might be careful was not worth the risk to his frigates. The infidels on their side remained very cautious near the Lord Bellerophon's guns and made sure to stay well clear of its gun range, even going so far as to not firing off a quick little speculative volley of torpedoes, just in case, which is a remarkable degree of discipline for a bunch of Chaos Raiders. After getting all of the data and information they could, they swiftly headed back out to the system edges, undoubtedly to reunite with the rest of the Chaos fleet. The Sword-class frigates were sent out once again to see if they couldn't get a bit of a sneak peek at whatever was incoming, again with strict orders to not engage the infidels in case there were other forces sneaking into the system as well. And roughly 6 days later, another report came across the Rear Admiral's desk. The report detailed a series of auger contacts obtained by the Sword frigates. They had identified at least 14 unique energy signatures in the incoming fleet, along with one energy signature of particular notice. In the midst of the enemy fleet, there was something of considerable size. The analysis of the drive signature came back as inconclusive, but it was at the very least a cruiser, and quite possibly something far larger. In response to this, the Admiral decided to change his plan. He had for a while now been cognizant of the fact that he was in all due likelihood well and truly boned. But with these numbers, and the likelihood of being bestially outgunned, he had to realize that it was no longer a theoretical. The giant spiked chaos penis was now well and truly a reality, and the only realistic course of action still open to him was to bite down as hard as possible in the hopes of inflicting some kind of damage. Having resigned his fleet more or less to its fate, he ordered a change in disposition. Rather than the ordered lines of battle, his ships would now all organize themselves into a single column of battle. Upon approaching the Chaos fleet, the lead ship would fire a volley of torpedoes with the hope of opening a gap in the enemy's battle lines, through which the column would then plunge in its entirety, firing from every single available gun, port and starboard. In this way, the flotilla would ensure its ability to make maximum use of its available firepower, doing as much damage to the Chaos Flotilla as possible, whilst also, granted, receiving as much damage as possible in return. By maximizing firepower in this way, the hope was that they would be able to cripple several Chaos ships. Then, the fire ships sheltering in the relative safety of the rear of the formation would light their engines to maximum and ram any Chaos ship that had been deprived of its means of maneuver. This would in turn hopefully entirely destroy the Chaos vessel. In theory, this plan would allow Raziek to inflict damage upon the Chaos fleet out of all proportions to his own formation size, and, even more importantly, it may allow him to inflict permanent damage via the complete destruction of Chaos vessels. And since fire ships don't really care all that much about differences in tonnage, there was also the possibility of the Admiral bagging himself some real big game with this strategy. The downsides of the strategy, however, were also quite considerable. The odds of Raziek's ragtag flotilla surviving this engagement were rather small. On the bright side, they would be passing through the enemy formation at battle speed, which hopefully would allow them to shoot through the formation and clean out the rear of the Chaos Flotilla, hopefully putting some significant distance between themselves and any potential pursuit. But before they got to that point, they would have to drag their undermanned, poorly maintained, slow asses through the engagement zone of every single enemy vessel in the flotilla. A safe plan, it most decidedly was not, but considering the limited nature of the Admiral's resources and the absolute need to inflict some actual damage upon the invaders, it was probably the best plan available. There was, of course, the danger that the enemy might foresee this plan and counter it, seeing as the Rear Admiral's fleet was ragtag in nature and slow as all sin, towing the defense monitors. It would be a small matter indeed for the Chaos Raiders to simply stay at lance range, firing torpedoes and scorching away the Imperial ship's armor at long range. However, they were fighting Chaos Raiders, never the most organized of lot, and it was a ragtag tiny Imperial fleet. In all due likelihood, the various Chaos champions captaining the vessels incoming would never adopt such a careful and cowardly strategy. After all, if they remained behind, attacking from range, somebody else might sneak in close and claim the glory, and we cannot have that. Oh, no, no, no. Most definitively no. And so, predictably enough, the Chaos Fleet was barreling down upon the Imperial Navy head-on. Because chaos. There was, however, one small problem with the current plan. The large energy signature that had been detected previously was now close enough to receive the attention of the Navy's auger readers, and they could positively identify it as the Anarchy's Heart, a Despoiler-class battleship, or, technically, an attack craft. Only 3 of these vessels were originally constructed in the mid-36th millennium by Battlefleet Tempestus, but were quickly discontinued because they proved to be not quite as efficient as originally hoped. Tempestus was of the opinion that attack crafts like the Despoiler class would eventually entirely replace battleships in the Imperial Navy, but this was not to be. Sometime thereafter, the STC plans for the Despoiler must have been stolen at some point, because whilst the Imperium are not building any further Despoilers, Chaos most definitively is, since there is a hell of a lot more than 3 of them bumping about the galaxy at this point in time. So, what does this actually mean? Well, Raziek's flagship was the cruiser Lord Bellerophon. In 40k, a cruiser is considered essentially a ship of the line, a mainstay of most navies. But a Despoiler-class attack craft, well, that's the very thing designed to break apart battle lines constructed of cruisers. And, well, there was no battle line of cruisers in front of the Anarchy's Heart. There was a cruiser. Now, a Despoiler class is an interesting mix of carrier and battleship. It boasts a battleship's lance batteries, allowing it to support its attack craft at long range, but it foregoes the bombardment abilities of a true battleship in favour of several hangars filled with assault crafts and bombers. This is the kind of ship that, by itself alone, would have been more than able to wreck the entire Imperial Navy complement above Vraks. All it would have to do was stay away. Its powerful engines, long-range lance batteries, and waves upon waves of attack crafts would be more than enough to tear apart the measly formations presented by the Imperial Navy. The defense monitors couldn't catch it in a billion years. The Sword-class frigates would barely be a match for the Despoiler's point defences, never mind its main weaponry. The only ship that could conceivably have stood something that resembled a chance against it was the Lord Bellerophon, and it only if they could close the distance. Fortunately, the Chaos Fleet had decided to be more than accommodating in this particular regard, as they were burning at full speed towards the Imperial Navy. Now, I do hasten to point out that this was not quite as retarded a decision as it at first sounds. On one hand, yes, they could have wiped out the entire Imperial Navy flotilla virtually without suffering any form of damage, but one, chaos doesn't work like that, and two, they were on the clock. They were certainly aware of the fact that the Imperium would have noticed them leaving the Eye of Terror, and they would also know that the Imperium does not like Chaos flotillas bumping around their backyard. There would be a response force incoming, and so the quicker the Chaos flotilla could reach Vraks, the better. There is also much to be said for a display of good old-fashioned brute force, and in this case, it almost worked. On the bridge of the Lord Bellerophon, Rear Admiral Raziek, seeing the insurmountable force that approached him, thought for a moment that it might be best to simply disengage. He could take his cruiser and his sword-class frigate and make for the outer edges of the system, hoping to return at a later date with further Imperial Navy reinforcements. His armed freighters would not be fast enough to escape, nor would his defense monitors or the fire ships. But of course, in a straight-up engagement, these ships were as good as doomed anyway. Would it then not be better for Raziek to take the ships that could escape and return to fight another day? Thusly stricken with indecision, Raziek was on the verge of ordering the retreat, when a report came from his auger crew stating that the Chaos Fleet had split in two distinct formations, and would pass by Raziek's battle line to port and starboard. The perfect scenario for his column assault plan. And whilst that meant that Raziek's fleet was no less doomed, it was the perfect scenario for inflicting damage upon the Chaos Fleet, and the very scenario he had already prepared himself for. And so his mind was made up. He issued the orders to his flag captain to instruct the crew to prepare to go meet Big E himself, as they would plunge right down the gullet of the beast, firing from all guns. The Rear Admiral was determined that if it was truly to be their fate to go meet Big E this day, they would do so with a nice, big, fat, shining achievement at their back. Shortly thereafter, the battle was officially initiated as planned by a long-range torpedo salvo fired from the Lord Bellerophon. 6 torpedoes in all. Now, in 40k terms, a torpedo is not really what you might imagine when hearing the word torpedo. They're more along the lines of gargantuan nuclear missiles that have a rudimentary guidance system that directs them through the void. They are capable of locking onto a target to a certain degree, but the nature of void warfare is very different from anything that might take place on land or at sea. Both the missile and its target will both be moving at ridiculous speeds, and to have the one intercept the other is no small task. When you add in the fact that Imperial cogitators have seen better days, a hit is never guaranteed. Thusly, the first torpedo missed the Anarchy's heart by, in void terms, narrow margins, which means a couple 100 kilometers. The second torpedo somehow detonated upon the Anarchy's heart's void shields, which I think is author for saying, I didn't actually look up how void shields function, because torpedoes pass right through those, but hey, details. The third torpedo was destroyed by defensive fire from the Anarchy's heart, and the fourth torpedo, also aimed at the attack craft, suffered a malfunction and detonated in the void, inflicting no further damage. The two last torpedoes, the 5th and the 6th, had been aimed rather speculatively at the Despoiler's escorts, a pair of Iconiclast destroyers. Now, these were very much so long shots, even though, again, guidance technology is reasonably effective, although limited. A light and, again, relatively speaking, small and fast ship, like a destroyer, can usually get itself out of the way of incoming ordnance like torpedoes, which are, relatively speaking, slow. And indeed, the first Iconoclast managed to dodge the torpedo. The second, however, was not so lucky. The captain was a second too late in adjusting his course, and the fiendish machine spirit aboard the Imperial torpedo got a solid lock, ramming itself and its melter warhead straight into the Iconoclast destroyer's midship, virtually shearing the small vessel in half. This prompted an immediate wave of cheers on the command bridge of the Lord Bellerophon. First blood went to the Imperial Navy, as the gutted Iconoclast destroyer drifted out of the enemy's battle line. Shortly thereafter, despite the best efforts of the ship's damage control crews, her plasma reactor would go critical, and turned the small ship into a brief and blindingly white supernova. The cheering aboard the Lord Bellerophon, however, was to be cut short mere moments thereafter, as the Despoiler class, clearly enraged by its prey's impudent show of resistance, opened fire with its lance batteries. At this range, there was quite literally nothing the poor Lunar class could do to respond. All the Lord Bellerophon could do was hunker down as well as possible, hope that his void shield somehow held up for long enough for them to get within effective range of their own weapons. It was going to be a long and bumpy ride. By the time the two fleets closed and began sliding slowly, almost majestically past one another, firing from all weapons, the Lord Bellerophon had been badly mauled. Virtually all of its void shields had overloaded, but the venerable old ship's massive armoured prow had stood up to the enemy's fire remarkably well. And through the Lunar-class cruiser's stubborn defiance in the face of enemy fire, the rest of the ragtag flotilla had been allowed to approach virtually unscathed. The Sword-class frigates immediately leapt upon the Anarchy's heart, worrying at it like dogs might a bone, the far smaller ships attempting desperately to inflict damage upon the far larger ship whilst avoiding the worst of its firepower. The defense monitors slid past slowly and majestically, firing their heavy weapons at the enemy's larger ships, leaving the Anarchy's heart to the Sword-class frigates, and the Lord Bellerophon fired on all guns at anything and everything that presented itself. Even the armed cruisers, cursed by their limited firepower, engaged and took the occasional potshot here and there, inflicting mostly superficial but still damage upon the Chaos Flotilla. It was, however, by no means a one-sided engagement, with the first Imperial ship to fall being the Sword-class XO-41, which was crippled by the Despoiler-class's lance batteries at virtually point-blank range. The smaller ship had been playing a cat-and-mouse game with the Chaos Gunners, darting in and out of their fields of fire, delivering its own weapon salvos, whilst darting out again just before the Chaos Gunners could get a lock. Unfortunately for XO-41, it was just a tad bit too slow on one of these occasions, and had half of its top decks sheared away in a single lance salvo, leaving the remainder of the small ship's decks either exposed to hard vacuum or on fire. But at least the Sword classes had the luxury of being able to get out of the line of fire of the much larger Chaos vessels. The poor system defense monitors had no such luxury. The Chaos Fleet correctly identified the lumbering defense platforms as the primary threat, and so concentrated their firepower upon them. Out of the original 3 defense monitors, only 1 emerged out of the engagement. Battered, bruised, and bleeding fire from several massive rents torn in the superstructure, it was virtually crippled, but still standing in the battle line. In return, the system defense monitors had aided the Lord Bellerophon in damaging Chaos-heavy transport, aboard which was God Emperor only knows how many tens of thousands of traitorous heretics, and they had also succeeded in destroying a second Iconoclast destroyer. The engagement had been lopsided, but nowhere near as lopsided as it could have been, and miraculously, the armed freighters had all survived the engagement, although not entirely intact. The Isra Moors had suffered particularly heavily, as she became the primary recipient of the attention of Chaos bomber wings, knocking out 3 of her 4 plasma reactors and leaving her dead in the void. But instead of abandoning ship, the Isra Moor's captain ordered his surviving crew members to man the guns, rerouting their minimal power to keep them operational and firing at the Chaos fleet. At the head of the column still stood Lord Bellerophon. Almost all of its void shield generators were now permanently out of action, having been overloaded and shut down to prevent them from exploding. Additionally, a macro cannon shell had pierced the number 2 engine room, killing virtually all of the tech adepts inside, and heavily damaging the plasma reactor. Luckily, damage control crews had been able to stabilize it and bring it back under control. The reactor had now been shut down permanently for fear of it too exploding. And there was no rest for the damage control crews. 2 of the starboard weapon batteries had been gutted, and then set alight. The vast quantities of ammunition had been set ablaze, and damage control crews were now fighting desperately to contain the fire sweeping through several decks. And for the cherry on top, the ship's primary communications tower had been sheared clean off the superstructure by a lance hit from the Anarchy's heart. The old warhorse had certainly seen better days, but for the moment it was still alive and fighting, although for how long that would remain so was a question that was yet to be answered. In front of the Lord Bellerophon was 2 further Chaos cruisers, and frankly, the old venerable Lunar class had barely survived its brush with the main Chaos battle line. Entering into a protracted gunfight with 2 further cruisers would almost certainly see her put to rest, along with what little remained of the Imperial flotilla. Over the Vox speakers, the Munastorum priests began reading the crew their last rites. Then Rear Admiral Raziek ordered the ship to heave to starboard, presenting what remained of his weapon batteries towards the 2 incoming cruisers as he prepared to sell his own life and those of his crew and ship as dearly as possible. Unbeknownst to the Rear Admiral, however, the God Emperor was working his miracles out in the cold darkness of the void. And slowly at first, but then with gathering speed, the 2 Chaos cruisers began to turn and disengage. Unbeknownst to Raziek, his flotilla was not the only Imperial Navy formation within the Vraxian system. Upon learning where the Chaos flotilla was headed, Battlefleet Scarus had immediately directed the closest battle-worthy force to reinforce the Vraxian Navy elements. This happened to be Cruiser Group Mazur, under Rear Admiral Titus Mazur. They had arrived in system shortly after the Chaos fleet, but Mazur was not overly interested in coming to the rescue of Raziek. His primary objective was to intercept the Chaos flotilla before it could deliver its reinforcements to Vraks. Additionally, he simply wasn't at all particularly interested in helping Raziek, as the 2 had a mutual dislike. Raziek had at one point been a second to a young officer who had been challenged in a duel by Titus Mazur and subsequently killed. To make matters worse, the 2 were also rivals, who couldn't seem to quite shake one another. Whenever one was promoted, the other was also shortly thereafter promoted. They had gained much the same in the way of plaudits and honours, and perhaps Mazur saw an opportunity to rid himself of a bothersome rival. Regardless, however, the two Chaos cruisers were not aware of this mutual dislike, and so they decided to focus their attention on the greater of the two threats, and in this case it was a badly battered and bruised Lunar-class cruiser and a handful of near-dead ships, or a cruiser group. Not a particularly difficult evaluation. To the crew of the Lord Bellerophon, however, it must have seemed like divine providence. They had no way of communicating at the moment, with their communication tower spinning happily through the void, and so all they could see was the two cruisers set to murder every last one of them, turning away and disengaging. For Mazur, however, it must have seemed the exact opposite. He had hoped that the two cruisers would be too busy blasting apart the hapless remnants of the defense fleet to intercept his formation. That might allow him just enough time, providing his fleet was under heavy burn, which it was, to intercept the enemy flotilla and disrupt their landing efforts. However, he simply could not ignore the two Chaos cruisers heading towards him, as they were probably the worst types possible in the situation. A Slaughter-class cruiser, a hit-and-run raider with massive short-range firepower, and a Devastation class, a long-range sniper with the ability to deploy attack craft. If Rear Admiral Mazir tried to simply just rush past, there was a real danger that the Devastation class's attack crafts would be able to cripple several of his warship's engines by focusing in on their drive plants. And then, dead in the water, the Slaughter class would be able to dart in and annihilate them. To prevent this from happening, Mazir dispatched one of his three cruisers, the Dominator class Orion, with its massive prow-mounted Nova cannon and batteries of macro cannon batteries. It would be a daunting task for the two cruisers to destroy. Staying at long range would put them at the mercy of the Nova cannon, but trying to dart in to cripple the ship would expose them to its multiple macro cannon batteries, and with the Sword-class frigates nearby, it was doubly risky. Meanwhile, the rest of Cruiser Group Mazir continued on intercept course. It now consisted of the Gothic-class cruiser Consul Thrashi and the Grand Cruiser Covenator. It might just be two ships, but they were two pretty damn large and powerful vessels. Additionally, the Chaos Flotilla would need to enter into low orbit to deploy their reinforcements, rendering them extremely slow and vulnerable to the two ships' firepower. It might not be enough to destroy the Chaos Flotilla, but it certainly would make the captains of said flotilla think twice about deploying their troops. Whilst all of this was going on, Raziek was still fighting his own private battle. Still unaware that Imperial reinforcements had arrived in system, he was desperately reorganizing what remained of his fleet, and he decided it was about time to deploy his reserves. The three fire ships that he so far had kept safe at the very back of his column. He had three ships, and for them he picked three targets. One was to strike the Blood Dawn, which was still engaged with his flotilla and currently in the process of launching Dreadclaw assault boats towards the crippled Isra Moors, with the intentions of capturing the armoured freighter for future Chaos use. The second fireship was heading directly towards the Anarchy's heart, which was one hell of a gamble. If it hit, it would take the battleship out of the fight, but the odds of that happening were rather small. And the third headed towards the Aron's Bane, the massive Chaos bulk transport that had been injured previously in the engagement by the Lord Bellerophon. It was a very ambitious gamble. Sending his fireships in against the largest enemy vessels ensured that if they hit, they would significantly impact the combat. But the odds of them hitting were, as mentioned, rather slim. and as if to prove that, the first fireship was torn apart with ease by the Blood Dawn as it tried to close. The second, aimed at the Anarchy's heart, was also swatted out of the void with nary a sidewards glance. But the third had better luck. With the Anarchy's heart distracted by the incoming fireship, it was unable to provide protection to the Aeron's Bane, who was slowing down in preparations for entering into the upper Vraxian atmosphere. This meant he was unable to take the evasive maneuvers necessary to avoid the third fireship. As far as the battle in the void was concerned, the Aeron's Bane was of virtually no consequence. It was lightly armed and armoured, an old Imperial bulk transport. But as far as the battle on the ground was concerned, it was probably the greatest threat in the system, as it was chock full of Chaos reinforcements. Tens of thousands of cultists, mutants, beastmen, and all manners of monstrosities baying for blood in its many holds. The crew of the fireship refused orders to abandon their vessel and instead guided it in to the very end, striking the Aeron's Bane directly amidship. This, unsurprisingly, inflicted crippling damage upon the heavy transport, and, preparing as it was to enter into low orbit, it had no way to escape. Caught in Vrax's gravity field, the ancient ship began its slow but inexorable fall towards the planet below. Once again, cheering broke out aboard the Lord Bellerophon. They saw the Aeron's Bane plunge towards the planet below and expected to never see it again. The Dark Gods, however, had different plans. Miraculously, the crew managed to regain enough control to fire their main engines. It was nowhere near enough to resist the fall to the planet's surface, but it was enough to right the ship and ensure that it did not simply plunge directly into the planet's surface. And by the grace of the ruinous powers, it carried out a relatively successful belly landing. What the Aeron's Bane did was certainly stretching the term, but after digging a kilometers-long gouge in the terrain of the Shalia Plateau, most of those aboard survived. And far worse was the fact that the Anarchy's heart had made low orbit undisturbed. Despite their best efforts, Cruiser Group Mazur was too late to stop the Anarchy's heart beginning to deploy its reinforcements. Even now, drop pods and landing crafts were streaming out of the battleship's hull, seeding the planet below with Alpha Legion and Chaos Warband reinforcements. The Chaos Flotilla had succeeded in its primary mission, and the Death Corps of Krieg was about to have a whole new load of friends to play with. As for the thrilling conclusion to the battle in the void, and how the Death Corps reacted to their new visitors, you're going to have to wait until the next episode. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider sharing it around to friends and like-minded individuals, as it really does help quite a lot. Anywho, until next time, have a good day.